The room went silent as Eric raised his glass, a grin spreading across his face like he was about to land the perfect punchline. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice thick with drama, eyes gleaming as he soaked in the attention. "To new beginnings, new homes, and—" He paused for effect, letting the tension build. "To Grandpa's memory." A respectful silence fell over the crowd. Our grandfather had passed just days ago, and the wound was still fresh. I raised my glass along with everyone else, quietly honoring the man who had meant the world to me. But then Eric, with a grin too wide for the occasion, dropped the bombshell. "Speaking of Grandpa," he said, setting his drink down with a deliberate thud, "I have an announcement to make." I froze, my pulse quickening. There was something about the way he looked at me, like a predator sizing up his prey. With a flourish, Eric reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, the edges worn from what seemed like rehearsed handling. My stomach churned. "Before he died," Eric continued, "Grandpa gave me this letter." He waved it like a trophy. "He wanted me to have the vacation home by the lake, the place we all loved as kids." The room erupted into surprised murmurs and congratulations. My parents beamed with pride. Eric's girlfriend, Brooke, clapped enthusiastically, and Megan, my cousin, shot me a confused glance. She knew how close Grandpa and I had been. I stood there, numb, unable to wrap my mind around what I'd just heard. The lakeside cabin was everything. Grandpa had poured his heart into it, and it was where I spent nearly every weekend for years, helping him maintain it, learning from him, building memories. Eric? He'd visited maybe twice in the last 5 years, always complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi. Yet somehow, he was now the heir. I stared at the envelope in Eric's hand. As he unfolded the letter, something didn't add up. Grandpa had already given me the property weeks ago, well before his passing. A small wooden box, a promise, and a notarized deed transferring ownership to me. This wasn't part of Grandpa's estate. It was mine. Eric began reading the letter aloud, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. I watched him closely. Was he lying? Did he know about the deed? My mind raced. Grandpa had never been one for complications. He told me the cabin was mine, and that was supposed to be it. "Great," I muttered, forcing a smile. "Good for you, Eric." But my heart was pounding. I needed to check that wooden box. I excused myself, saying I needed to use the bathroom. Once the door closed behind me, I leaned against it, hands shaking. The letter Eric was reading didn't make sense. Grandpa's handwriting was shaky in his final months due to arthritis, but the signature I glimpsed, it looked too smooth, too confident. My phone buzzed. Megan's text. "You okay?" That was weird. Eric never even cared about the cabin. I texted back quickly. "Need to check something at home." "Can you cover for me?" Say I got called into work. Within minutes, Megan had made my excuses to the family. I slipped out the back door as Eric basked in his newfound inheritance. The drive home was a blur. Streetlights streaked by as memories of Grandpa flooded my mind. The quiet mornings fishing off the dock, nights spent stargazing, his laugh as I tried and failed to skip stones across the lake. The vacation home wasn't just property. It was where my greatest memories lived, and it was mine. It was time to find out exactly what Eric was trying to pull. Eric had never cared about the cabin, not really. He'd show up only when it suited him, using it as a party house, complaining about everything from the lack of Wi-Fi to the boring view. But today, he was standing in front of everyone, claiming what wasn't his to take. I felt my blood boil. This wasn't just about property. It was about respect, and he had none for either Grandpa's memory or me. The second I got home, I knew I had to act. I walked straight to my closet, grabbed Grandpa's old cigar box, and sat down on the floor. My fingers shook as I lifted the lid. "Don't open this until you need to know the truth," Grandpa's voice echoed in my mind. I'd never forgotten that warning. Inside the box were the papers that would tear Eric's lie apart. A notarized deed signed 6 months ago, with my name in bold, and there, nestled beside it, was Grandpa's letter, written in his unsteady hand. "My dearest Elise," it began, "by the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. I've decided to give you the cabin while I'm still alive to avoid any complications. You're the only one who truly loved this place as much as I did. Your brother never showed interest except when he needed a place to throw parties when I wasn't around." I swallowed hard. The anger was rising, but so was something else. Vindication. Eric had known all along. Grandpa had already given me the cabin, and now Eric was trying to steal it. I kept reading, hands trembling as the truth settled over me like a heavy cloak. "I know your brother might contest this, which is why I've had everything properly notarized and filed. There's a copy with my lawyer, Richard Collins. The cabin is legally yours already. This isn't part of my will or estate. I trust you to honor the spirit of our special place." My mind reeled. Eric had fabricated a letter to manipulate everyone, to claim something that wasn't his, and he was brazen enough to say it in front of the whole family. The audacity. My phone buzzed with messages. Eric, then my parents, all wondering where I'd gone. Eric's text was the last straw. "Nice disappearing act. Don't worry, you can still visit the cabin if you ask nicely." That was it. I wasn't going to waste time texting him back or explaining myself. I needed action, not words. I tucked the letter and deed back in the box and grabbed my keys. The party was still going strong at his place, but I wasn't going back inside. Not yet. This wasn't about making a scene. Number Grandpa had always said, "When you have truth on your side, Elise, you don't need to shout it from the rooftops. The quiet truth hits harder than any loud lie." I drove to Eric's house, parked a block away. The wooden box sat in the passenger seat like a weight I was ready to carry. Sitting in the car, my heart raced, but my mind was clear. I thought about the years spent at the cabin with Grandpa, how it had always been our place, the one place where nothing else mattered. Eric had never truly cared about it, but I had, and now it was mine, legally, ethically, and rightfully. I texted Megan asking how many people were still at the party. "Just family now," she replied. "Most guests left after dinner. Are you coming back?" Perfect. This needed to be private. I took a deep breath, grabbed the box, and walked to Eric's door. When I knocked, it wasn't a surprise, but a weary Eric who answered. His eyes flickered between recognition and something else, maybe guilt, maybe uncertainty. But it didn't matter anymore. I stood there, calm and collected as he opened the door, half smiling, half confused. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to regain control. I didn't even blink. "I'm here for the truth," I said, stepping past him. "And to set things straight." I stepped into the house, past Eric, who shot me a skeptical glance. "Is the work emergency over already?" he asked, the suspicion clear in his voice. I didn't flinch. "We need to talk, Eric," I said coolly, stepping inside. The air in the room shifted immediately. My father was inspecting the letter Eric had read to everyone, while my mother was already diving into renovation plans for the cabin with Brooke. Megan sat off to the side, her discomfort as obvious as it was silent. "Elise is back," my mother said, unnecessarily loud, her voice cutting through the tension. "We were just discussing Eric's wonderful news about the cabin." I didn't waste a moment. "Actually," I said, placing the wooden box down on the coffee table with deliberate force, "that's exactly what I wanted to talk about." Eric's eyes locked onto the box. Recognition flickered across his face like a shadow he couldn't shake. "What's that?" he asked, trying to mask the unease in his voice, though I knew he already had a pretty good idea. "Something Grandpa gave me 3 weeks ago," I replied, my voice steady. "He asked me not to open it until the time was right. I think that time is now." Before Eric could get a word out, my father leaned forward, intrigued. "What is it, Elise?" I took my time opening the box, removing the notarized deed, and placing Grandpa's letter on the table. "6 months ago," I said, letting the words hang in the air, "Grandpa legally transferred the ownership of the vacation home to me. It's already mine, not part of his estate or will." The room went still. My mother's mouth hung open, and my father, his brow furrowed, picked up the deed, his fingers brushing over it as if expecting it to disappear. Eric stood frozen, his face paling. "This is notarized," my father muttered, his gaze still fixed on the documents. "And this is definitely your grandfather's signature." Eric's breath caught in his throat. "This is impossible," he sputtered, his voice rising in panic. "Grandpa gave me the letter. He wanted me to have the cabin." I didn't hesitate. "May I see that letter?" I asked, extending my hand toward my father. He handed it over without a word. I placed it next to the letter from my box. The difference was glaring. The handwriting on Eric's letter was a sloppy imitation, devoid of the shakiness that came with Grandpa's arthritis. The signature, too neat, too flawless, wasn't even close to Grandpa's. "Eric," my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper, "did you forge this letter?" The silence from Eric was deafening. He shifted uncomfortably, his face twitching with a mix of guilt and desperation. Finally, his voice broke, raw and defensive. "You don't understand. It's not fair that she gets everything." "Everything?" I asked, genuinely baffled. "What are you talking about?" Eric's words spilled out like they were clawing their way to freedom. "You were always Grandpa's favorite," he blurted. "Always visiting him, always helping him, always the perfect grandchild. The rest of us barely got a look in." My father shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to navigate the messy waters of Eric's confession. "Eric," he said finally, "regardless of how you feel, forging your grandfather's signature is serious." I didn't need my father to say any more. My mother took the letters from the table, comparing them side by side. Her face shifted from disbelief to deep disappointment. "Oh, Eric," she sighed, shaking her head. "How could you do this?" Brooke, who'd been sitting quietly beside Eric, stood up slowly. "I think I should go," she muttered, her voice shaking with the realization. She grabbed her purse, avoiding Eric's pleading gaze, and walked toward the door. "Wait, Brooke," Eric called after her, his voice desperate. But it was too late. She was already gone, the front door slamming behind her. The silence in the room was suffocating. Megan caught my eye from across the room and gave me a subtle nod of support. She'd always seen through Eric's antics, something our parents had failed to do for years. "I don't understand," my father said quietly, turning to Eric. Eric's face was drained, his last lie hanging in the air like poison. The truth had landed hard. "Why would you announce something like this without even checking if it was true?" I asked, my voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "The will reading isn't until next week." Eric's face flushed with a mixture of rage and humiliation, his posture stiffening. "I found out about the deed," he confessed, his voice tense with frustration. "I was at Grandpa's lawyer's office last week, asking about the estate, and Collins mentioned that the cabin wasn't part of it because it had already been taken care of. He wouldn't tell me more, but I knew what that meant." His words hung in the air, like a bad confession. I thought if I announced it first, maybe..." "Maybe what?" my mother pressed, her voice cold, a challenge in her words. "Maybe Elise would just let you have it?" His voice cracked, laced with desperation. "Maybe everyone would believe me instead of her for once. Maybe I could have something that mattered to Grandpa, too." The bitterness in his voice hit like a punch to the gut. He'd felt left out, left behind, and I could feel a strange twist in my chest. Was that why he'd done this? Eric, I said, my voice softer than I intended. Grandpa invited you to the cabin countless times. You always said you were too busy. Because I felt like an intruder, Eric spat back, his words sharp with years of resentment. By the time I realized what I was missing, it was too late. You two had your special bond, your inside jokes, your traditions. There was no room for me. My father's eyes filled with disappointment as he shook his head. That doesn't justify lying to the entire family, son. Eric slumped into a chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. So what happens now? He asked, not meeting anyone's gaze. You win, Elise. You've made your point. This isn't about winning, I replied, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Despite his actions, he was still my brother, and Grandpa had loved him too, in his own way. I reached back into the wooden box and pulled out something I hadn't shown yet, a sealed envelope with Eric's name written in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. He left something for you, too, I said, holding it out to him. Eric glanced at me with a mixture of suspicion and hope. What is it? I don't know, I admitted, the honesty in my words cutting through the tension. Grandpa told me not to open anything that wasn't addressed to me. Eric hesitated but finally took the envelope, tearing it open with shaking hands. As he read the letter, his posture faltered, his face going from defensive to shocked, then to something like remorse. He knew, Eric whispered, his voice barely audible. He knew I might try to claim the cabin. My mother moved to sit beside him, her face a picture of curiosity and concern. What does it say, honey? Eric hesitated, then handed her the letter. Read it, he said. Everyone should hear it. My mother adjusted her glasses and began reading aloud. Dear Eric, if you're reading this, then Elise has opened my cedar box, which means one of two things. Either I'm gone, or something has happened that made her feel it was necessary to reveal its contents. I've known you since the day you were born, and I know your heart. You've always wanted recognition and validation, things I perhaps failed to give you in the way you needed. But I also know that when you feel overlooked, you sometimes make impulsive decisions that hurt others and ultimately yourself. The cabin has been transferred to Elise. This was a decision I made with great thought and love, not because I didn't care for you, but because Elise connected with the place in a way you never did. She understood what made it special to me, and I trust her to preserve that spirit. What you need isn't a property, Eric. It's a purpose. I've enclosed a check for $25,000. Use it to start something meaningful. Find what makes your heart come alive the way the cabin does for Elise. Maybe it's that business idea you mentioned last Christmas, or perhaps something else entirely. I hope someday you'll understand that this isn't about favorites or fairness. It's about recognizing different paths for different hearts. Elise will keep the door open for you at the cabin. I have no doubt, but your future lies in building something of your own. With love and hope, Grandpa. When my mother finished reading, the silence was deafening. My father's gaze softened with regret, and even Megan's eyes were filled with unshed tears. Eric sat frozen, his head bowed in defeat, the check clutched tightly in his hand. He saw right through me, Eric murmured, his voice breaking. He knew. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just about a house. It was about redemption, about making the right choices, and about Grandpa's final message. The truth had crushed him, but it was also the only thing that could save him. The weight of the moment hung in the air as my father, finally showing a flicker of understanding, placed a hand on Eric's shoulder. Your grandfather was a perceptive man, he said, his voice steady, yet filled with a quiet reverence. Eric, eyes reddened from emotion, met my gaze. For the first time in years, he actually saw me. I'm sorry, Elise. I had no right to try and take what was already yours. The apology was raw, uncomfortable, but there was sincerity in it, something I hadn't expected. I nodded, holding back any rush to forgive. Acknowledging was enough for now. "There's something else in the box," I said, my voice calm as I reached for it again. I pulled out a small photo album, worn at the edges, the pictures spanning years of memories. Eric's gaze flickered from me to the album. His curiosity piqued. I opened it to reveal pictures of us as kids at the cabin, Eric and I, laughing in front of the fire, building sandcastles at the lake, Grandpa smiling behind us, his arms wrapped around us both. I paused on a photo of Grandpa and me more recently. "He kept this in his desk at the cabin," I explained softly. "He never stopped hoping you'd come around. He wanted to connect with you, Eric." Eric stared at the images, and for the first time in what felt like forever, something vulnerable crossed his face. "I really messed up, didn't I?" he murmured. "Yes," I said, not sugarcoating it. "But Grandpa obviously believed you could do better." The room fell silent, but it was a different silence, no longer filled with anger, but reflection. It felt like something had shifted. Megan, who had been watching silently, finally spoke up. "So, what happens now?" Her question hung in the air, as if we were all still processing the chaos. I closed the wooden box, feeling the weight of Grandpa's legacy on my shoulders. "Now," I said quietly, "we try to honor what Grandpa wanted for both of us." The gathering fizzled out soon after. My parents exchanged tense glances torn between disappointment and concern for Eric's future. Megan squeezed me into a hug, whispering, "Call me tomorrow." Then, the house went quiet, leaving just Eric and me. The celebratory atmosphere had evaporated like smoke. Eric mechanically brewed coffee, neither of us truly wanting it. The tension between us was thick, like it had always been, years of unresolved competition hanging over us. "I didn't plan it," Eric finally muttered, setting a mug in front of me. "The forgery, I mean. When I found out about the deed, I was angry and hurt. I made the letter that night, not really thinking I'd ever use it." "Then why did you?" I asked, wrapping my hands around the warm mug, feeling the weight of his confession. Eric stared into his coffee, as if searching for the right words. "When everyone was here tonight, celebrating my new house, I wanted something bigger to announce, something that would make me feel seen." His voice cracked as he looked up at me. "I've always been jealous of what you had with Grandpa. I never understood it until now." I studied him, feeling the sting of years of misunderstanding. "You could have had it too, Eric. He wanted that. He always wanted that." "I know that now," Eric whispered, his voice shaking, "but I was too proud, too stubborn."
He hesitated before asking, "What are you going to do with the cabin?" I leaned back, thinking. "Keep it as it is," I said. "It needs some repairs, but I don't want to change its character." Eric nodded, relief flickering across his face. "That's good. It should stay the way Grandpa loved it." I stared at him for a long moment, processing everything. "You're welcome there, you know. Anytime." Eric blinked in surprise. "Even after everything?" "The cabin was meant to bring family together, not tear us apart," I said firmly. "That doesn't mean I'm not still angry, or that I trust you completely right now, but the door is open." Eric seemed to understand my olive branch for what it was, tentative, cautious, but sincere. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We sat in silence for a while, sipping the now cold coffee, both of us lost in thought. It had been a long, emotional night. "I should go," I said, standing. "It's been a long night." Eric walked me to the door, his face a mixture of exhaustion and contemplation. Just before I stepped out, he turned to me with a question that had clearly been weighing on him. "Do you think Grandpa knew this would happen?" The showdown over the cabin? I thought about it. Grandpa's meticulous planning, the notarized deed, the separate letters for us both, and his quiet wisdom that had always seemed to see beyond the surface. Yeah, I said quietly. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. And just like that, everything changed. I think he hoped it wouldn't, I said, my voice steady, matching his quiet disbelief. But Grandpa was prepared for anything. Eric's face twisted into a rueful grin, as if he'd been caught in a game he couldn't quite win. He always was 3 steps ahead of everyone, he muttered, more to himself than to me. That he was, I agreed, the truth heavy between us. As I drove home, the wooden box sat beside me, its weight now a symbol of everything Grandpa had entrusted to me. A strange mix of emotions rolled through me, sadness for the pain, relief that the truth was finally laid bare, and a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something different between Eric and me. The keys to the cabin in my pocket felt heavy with responsibility, metal and memory wrapped up in one. Grandpa had trusted me with something precious, and I would honor that trust. But I couldn't ignore the flicker of possibility. Could there be room for Eric in this new chapter too, if he met me halfway? The next morning, I drove up to the cabin, the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders. The familiar scent of pine greeted me as I turned into the gravel driveway, the early sun casting long shadows through the trees, bathing everything in a soft golden light. The cabin stood there, just as I remembered, its cedar siding weathered by time, the green shutters still gleaming in the sun. I paused, taking it all in. This was no longer just a place, this was mine now, a sanctuary that held memories, laughter, and years of Grandpa's wisdom. I could almost see him, sitting in his old rocking chair on the porch, a baseball cap pulled low over his brow as he dozed in the afternoon sun. The cabin key slid into the lock with its familiar resistance, as if the place itself was reluctant to let go of the past. Grandpa had always insisted on the quirk, convinced it kept out the riffraff. Inside, everything was as it had been, the same cluttered comfort, the books stacked high, the fishing gear neatly organized in the corner, and the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering despite his years of trying to quit. As I walked through, my fingers brushed the furniture, old and worn but full of history, full of us. The stillness of the cabin wasn't oppressive. It felt almost like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Megan's name flashed on the screen. "How's the cabin?" "Your mom called me this morning. Eric's a wreck," I typed back. "Cabin's perfect." Not sure how to feel about Eric yet. Her reply came quickly. "He's been calling everyone trying to explain himself. Your parents are still upset." Not surprising, I thought. Trust, once shattered, takes time to rebuild. I set my phone down and walked to the picture window, the lake stretching out before me. The water shimmered in the sunlight, calm and unchanging. Despite the chaos around me, it was serene, quiet. I whispered, "I'm here, Grandpa. I'll take good care of it. I promise." 3 weeks passed in a blur before I heard from Eric. The text was simple. "Can we talk? At the cabin, maybe?" I sat on it for a day. Part of me wasn't ready to share this space with him. Not yet. But Grandpa's voice, steady and clear, echoed in my mind. Holding grudges makes the heart heavy, Elise. Sometimes forgiveness is more for you than for them. With a deep breath, I texted back with a time and date. Saturday came, and there he was, Eric's car pulling up. His steps slow, hesitant. I sat on the porch swing, nursing a cup of coffee, watching the morning light dance on the water. "This place hasn't changed a bit," Eric said quietly as he approached, glancing around, taking it all in. I didn't answer immediately, letting the weight of everything hang in the air. He was standing on the precipice, finally acknowledging the ground beneath his feet. The question was no longer about the cabin, it was about us, about the fractured bond Grandpa had tried to mend even from the grave. The truth had been laid bare, and now it was time to decide what came next. The moment was heavy, charged with the kind of tension that only years of pent-up frustration and unspoken words could create. Eric's apology was like a quiet storm, raw and stripped of the usual layers of bravado he clung to. I could hear the cracks in his voice, the shame of realizing that everything he thought he wanted had been a reflection of a broken sense of belonging. He wasn't just apologizing for the forgery, he was apologizing for a lifetime of missed moments, all wrapped up in a false notion that a cabin could somehow heal everything he hadn't understood before. I didn't let him off the hook immediately. The truth came out slowly, like peeling layers off an old wound. His explanation about the cabin, how he thought it would buy back lost time, give him what he thought he deserved, wasn't an excuse. But it made me see him differently. It wasn't the typical Eric manipulation. This time, there was real pain in his words. The prideful, entitled mask he wore had slipped, revealing the human being beneath, trying desperately to fix what he didn't know how to. When he admitted to using Grandpa's check for the woodworking course, it was a small thing, but so significant. Eric, always too impatient for such simple pleasures, had found something to cling to that felt real. I didn't expect it, but it made the whole situation more layered. For the first time in years, Eric wasn't just looking for validation, he was actually trying to better himself. Then came the moment of truth. I showed him Grandpa's brag book. It wasn't just the cabin that Grandpa had left me, it was the connections, the family ties, the moments of pride that had been silently waiting for us to notice. Eric had been so caught up in what he didn't have, he hadn't seen what Grandpa had been quietly collecting for him. His surprise at seeing how deeply Grandpa had cared was palpable, his remorse real. But the real change came when I offered him something concrete, a chance to rebuild, to actually contribute, and to be part of something that could heal both of us. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a symbol, and Grandpa had passed it on, not just for its value, but for its potential to bring us together. As we sat there, the quiet of the lake settling over us, Eric finally understood. The cabin wasn't just a property to inherit, it was a role to play in the family. And for once, I didn't feel alone in that responsibility. Maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild, not just the cabin, but the fractured family that had been too broken for too long.